Peace, folks. This is your brother David Rodriguez with another episode of Hispaniola History Channel. And with this episode, I just want to point out the blatant propaganda that the powers that be out there wants to propagate in terms of the history of the island, the continual miseducation in terms of who were the early people on the island. This is the Hispaniola History Channel, La Historia de Hispaniola, presented by David Rodriguez. As expressed in earlier episodes, we talked about the Portuguese early presence and the partnerships they were forming with certain tribes in Brazil. We talked about war captives that they took from surrounding islands, particularly from the Bahamas, the Lucayan Islands. This was your early population on the island of Hispaniola. But I just wanted to point out this particular article from the BBC entitled Santo Domingo, the city that kept slavery silent. So that's the title of the article, and is referencing a quote-unquote black woman who was found on the island during the times of Nicolas de Ovando. Now, as covered on the previous episode, we stated that when the island's population started to decline, at the time the governor Nicolas Ovando ordered that the population be replenished by seeking out those in the surrounding islands. This was an order not only from Ovando, but from the Spanish crown themselves. I just want to read something from an article written by Lebawet Lily Germa from November 2020, a BBC article titled Santo Domingo, the city that kept slavery silent. I just want to read something here. It has some interesting information, but like I said, it misguides the reader because it does not tell the full story of what happened on the island. Let me read here. It says the Dominican Republic was home to the first black people in the Americas. So why has Europe's oldest permanent settlement in the Americas turned its back on Africa's past? So you see what they did right there. They just first said black people, then they say African past. Now there's a difference there. If you want to talk melanated people, I could agree with you on that. Yes, we covered in previous episodes how the Portuguese, in particular the Sephardic Jews of Portugal, were already melanated. Not only were they melanated, we have accounts of them being very black. So where this sentence here, where it says the Dominican Republic was home of the first black people, you're talking about the Sephardic Jews and the Moors who were being kicked out of Spain and finding refuge on the north coast of Hispaniola. We have records of that. But let me read on in terms of how this article is somehow twisting history to form a certain narrative. It says here, thick red brick walls towered over me as I made my way inside the gated 16th century ruins of the Hospital del San Nicolas de Bari in the heart of Santo Domingo's UNESCO-inscribed colonial city. My guide, Maribel Nunez, an activist and leader of the Acción Afro-Dominicana, a non-profit organization based here in the Dominican Republic's capital, began telling the story of Misila, La Negra de Hospital, or the black woman who lived here in the early 1500s, and inspired then Spanish Nicolas Ovando to build this historical first hospital in the Americas. There was a black woman curing the sick in her humble shack, which was located right where the Hospital de Bari was built, Nunez said. She used her knowledge of natural medicine to save lives. So here's an account of a woman, La Negra de Hospital, in Hispaniola, curing the sick prior to Nicolas Ovando, the governor, who kicked out Columbus, by the way. So for you to have a setup already curing the native population in Hispaniola, this had to have been an individual who had knowledge of these medicines and of these herbs, which means you had to have been there for a long time. And not only that, been there long enough to build a shack to heal the people. Let me read on here in this article. It says the story of this faceless, nameless Afro-Dominican heroine who Nunez decided to call Misila. She was given his name to humanize her story, since part of the dehumanization of slavery was to erase people's names. Now hold it right there. There's no records of this La Negra de Hospital being a slave. No records whatsoever. the author, whoever's putting this article together, is already equating this native inhabitant of Hispaniola, La Negra, already equating her to enslaved. There's no records of her being a slave. So let me read on. It's documented in a 16th century manuscript that scholars at the University of New York's Dominican Studies Institute transcribed when researching the first African presence in the Dominican Republic. Now, you're researching the first African presence in the Dominican Republic, but in the actual manuscript itself, it does not say African or Africa. It says La Negra de Hospital. That's how she's described as, right? So we cannot change the narrative by adding words here. Let me read on. In a letter to the Spanish crown about the new hospital, the Archbishop of Santo Domingo described its origins as linked to a pious black woman who sheltered all the poor people she could and cure them as far as she was able to. Let me read that again. A pious black woman who sheltered all the poor people she could and cure them as far as she was able to. Now, this is a letter from the Archbishop of Santo Domingo to the Spanish crown. This is a correspondence going back and forth talking about this pious black woman. Pious meaning someone who's very honorable, very religious. They're saying very good words about this woman. No way they're degrading her or somehow dehumanizing her. So let me read down a little bit because it talks about, some celebrations in terms of honoring this black woman, La Negra de Hospital. Here's an image here. It says to many Dominicans of African descent can trace their lineage back to this faceless woman who helped establish the hospital. Let me read here. It says, few people realize that the Dominican Republic was home to the first black people in the Americas, who were initially brought here from present-day Senegal and the Gambia, and in the 1490s by Christopher Columbus. Now they're changing this whole story and narrative around, saying that Christopher Columbus went to Senegambia and brought black slaves from West Africa. We know that's an absolute lie. There's no records to say that at all. We know exactly who came over. We know we have the records until 1510, I believe, was the first big arrival. They were described as Ladinos. We have the history of who Ladinos are. Ladinos are people who were in Spain, Sephardic Jews, the Moors. These are the Ladinos, people who were in Spain, being kicked out of Spain. So this whole narrative of Columbus going to Senegal and Gambia before arriving to Hispaniola, this is totally made up. It says here, it was also where the Atlantic slave trade began in 1503. Hold up. So you're saying the transatlantic slave trade started in 1503? That's totally false. Furthermore, the hospital wasn't built or started to get built around this time. So if you didn't start your slave trade supposedly until after 1503, then how did this black woman arrive on the island? They're not saying that. They don't want to admit that there was a melanated woman, sheltering the poor, curing the sick on the island before the arrival of Nicholas Ovando. So instead of just admitting that, hey, some of these people might have came from the surrounding islands, or quite simply were already on the island. Because if you have no records of you bringing in this person on the island, then you will have to admit she was already on the island. And this goes hand in hand with the information we've been getting into in terms of the surrounding islands and their inhabitants, particularly the Lucayans. You had the Sagayos, you had some other tribes, and these people were practicing a matriarchal system that involved herbs and healing and natural healing and certain rituals. So instead of admitting that the early population of Hispaniola consists of, one, the melanated people that were coming from Spain, and two, the melanated people that were already here. There is no records of them bringing West Africans into Hispaniola in 1503. And if that was the case, how was it that this woman was able to come in, set up a shack, started healing the poor? And, this takes process. This takes a long time. This takes a process of knowing the plants, knowing the herbs, knowing the people, knowing the layout, getting the respect of the people for you to even make a setup such as a hut to heal the people. So it's time to be honest with history, be honest with ourselves, and be honest with the history of the island. And it's okay to admit that, yeah, there might have been a melanated presence on the island, melanated women who had high status in the Caribbean doing what they do. And the Europeans view that enough so to remember her and document her as being someone who had a presence, a positive presence on the island. So we're going to leave it right there. We're going to start digging further into the history of Hispaniola. Honor, respect, and praise to this ancestor, La Negra de Hospital, the official title of being the first hospital in the Americas. Hope you enjoyed this information, folks. This is your brother David Rodriguez with another episode of Hispaniola History Channel. And let's open up the conversation in terms of who Dominicans are and who are the ancestors of those who stem from the island. This is your brother. Peace. This is the Hispaniola History Channel, La Historia de Hispaniola, presented by David Rodriguez.